Dr. Pierce's topic for tonight on allyship is really important in that, as those of us perhaps who have been in positions or come from places of privilege have learned to be aware of how other voices have been silenced or not listened to, and have hopefully stepped back to give those voices room. We need to hear how best we can be good allies and to use our voices appropriately as we all work together for the ends of justice that we share. So it's my really deep pleasure to introduce the new Dean for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion and Chief Diversity Officer of Centenary College, Dr. Latoya Pierce.
Thank you. Thank you first to Dr. Holloman for the welcome and the warm introduction. I appreciate that. Thank you to all of you who have taken time out of your day to join me this evening, and those of you on Zoom who are joining me virtually. First, before I get into my presentation, I want to, of course, say thank you and start with gratitude. Gratitude to all of the faculty and staff that were involved in the coordination of all the events for Dream Week. Job well done. And a thank you as well to our Black Student Union as well, who were as well affiliated and in coordination and worked very diligently to provide feedback and to provide ideas and thoughts on Dream Week. And so first, I just wanted to start off by saying thank you. Secondly, I want to emphasize how excited I am to be here as your founding Dean of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion and Chief Diversity Officer. I have received such a warm welcome here at Centenary College of Louisiana from faculty, staff, and students. And so I'm a Louisiana native, but I was briefly in New York State, Western New York. And so I'm happy to be back, even though it's a little bit chilly. It's nothing compared to the -3 that's going on right now in Western New York, so I'm very happy to be back home. I want to start, before we get into the presentation, I want to talk a little bit about my journey, because I think it's going to help frame where we're going tonight and let you know a little bit more about me. I have been doing, I would say, diversity, equity, inclusion work for about 17, 18 years. That's been as a faculty member teaching a multicultural counseling class. That's been working as a consultant. That's been working presenting at different workshops and conferences and summits and seminars. But some way, shape, or form, I've been involved in this work, and this is the work that's always excited me. It wasn't the work that I even knew I would do, I think, starting off in my academic career. I am a counselor educator by trade. I'm a licensed therapist. But teaching diversity courses was actually my first teaching assignment. I won't say when, back in the day. And it was I think at the very beginning it was a little bit bittersweet, because it's a challenging course to teach, as you might imagine. But it is so rewarding and so fulfilling when you get to see, even within the parameters of a semester, the growth that happens in students from the first class until the end. When I talk about cultural competency and I talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, I always talk about the fact that this is a lifelong process, it's a lifelong journey, and it's a lifelong commitment. I always tell students, and when I talk and give lectures and workshops, I say, listen, you're not supposed to be culturally competent at the end of this semester, but you are supposed to have moved or had some progress in terms of where you began in this journey and moving along towards more awareness, as Dr. Holloman alluded to, more understanding, more cultural humility as well. So what I want to do today, this evening, is I'm going to try to blend two things together and hope that they marry well. I'm going to talk about allyship, because I think that honors the legacy and the work of Dr. King. But I would be remiss if I also didn't meld into that the needs of students and faculty of color, because it is so intertwined and it's so related. So I'm going to try to marry the two together and hope that we can kind of get this going. So Sarah, we'll go ahead and get started. So I want to start here. Every time I start a presentation, I like to have a framework to kind of give us a roadmap. So I'll start with an MLK quote: "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly." So what I think about when I try to conceptualize that quote, and I think about Dr. King's work on allies and allyship, one, I think about his ability to work across the table, to extend himself to others. I think about his ability to understand the power of collective voices for freedom and equality. And I also think about his ability to understand this African proverb: if you want to go fast, go alone. And if you want to go far, go together. There is, we have this call to allyship, we have this call to collective voices, we have this call to work together, we have this idea and ideal that this is the work of many and not the work of few. Next slide. Okay, thank you. So I want to start with, what is allyship? Allyship to me is action-oriented. It's a verb. It's something that we do. It's a state or condition of being an ally, as defined by Merriam-Webster. It is supportive association with another person or group. Specifically, though, it is such an association with the members of a marginalized or mistreated group to which one does not belong. So when we think about this idea of, again, allyship, we're thinking, and I'll talk a little bit later about maybe some of the differences between performative allyship, because there are different types of allyship, and more so deeper level allyship. We'll talk about the big A for allyship, and we'll talk about the little a and the differences between the two as well. So, allyship behaviors and expectations. I want to spend a little bit of time here because I think it's important for us to kind of walk into allyship eyes wide open and to understand what allyship requires of us and what the expectations are. So the first thing, of course, is expect to be uncomfortable. In any situation where we are a change agent, where we are an advocate, where we are an ally, but anytime we're involved in a change process, we have to have the expectation that there will be uncomfortable moments. We also want to make space for imperfection, that this is not a perfect process, but it is indeed just holding space for the fact that it is a process. We may accomplish a few steps forward and then have a setback, but holding space and making space for imperfection. Seek and expect feedback. I will be the first to tell you that anytime you're involved in DEI work or being an ally, being an advocate, you will indeed get feedback of what's going well, what's not going well, but expect that feedback. I think you hold space for that, the fact that this is not going to be a perfect process, but I'm holding space for feedback because feedback helps me grow, it helps me understand what's working and what's not working. Speak up and give feedback as well. This is our responsibility as an ally, as an advocate to speak up, give feedback to others as well. This next one, I'm going to put on and I think Tina will appreciate this, my counselor hat. Be an attentive listener. I talk to clients, especially in couples therapy, about being an attentive listener. Listening to make sure that person feels seen and feels heard instead of listening to respond. And so practicing this skill, practicing this idea of being an attentive listener, that I'm holding space for this person's experience and truly understanding that this is their phenomenology, this is their lived experience, that it's not for me to try to interpret, it's not for me to try to make it fit into my lens, but it's simply for me to be an attentive listener, for me to understand, and to exercise and show empathy as well. So I want to talk about ally roles. And I call them roles. The slide says types of allies. I like to say roles instead because I don't want to think in terms of this being a singular mindset or a singular definition of what my role as an ally will be. I think of this instead as you will play any and all of these roles depending on the situation and depending on the person maybe that you're being an ally for or being an ally with. So some of those roles, the sponsor. So sponsor ally points out and gives credit to others for their ideas and expertise in front of others in small, controlled settings. The amplifier. Amplifiers work to make sure that all voices are heard and respected, but especially those that belong to marginalized groups. The confidant, and I have a story that kind of goes along with that one. The confidant is very open, listening to and believing the negative experiences that people in underrepresented groups have experienced. So at a previous institution, I had a colleague, and I was functioning as that person's supervisor. And she emailed me, and she said, I need to talk to you, and I need to talk to you now. And I stopped what I was doing. Luckily, didn't have a lot of meetings going on at the time, so I was able to stop and kind of hold space for her to confide in me. There had been microaggressions, some discriminatory behavior that had been directed towards her. And she said, Latoya, I need you to just be my confidant right now. Not my supervisor, not anything else, but I need a safe space. This is a woman that looked like me. She was an African-American woman. And she said, I have a meeting in 1 hour where I'm gonna have to perform, I'm gonna have to work with other colleagues. If I walk into that meeting where I am right now, it's not gonna be good, and it's not gonna be good for me, and it's not gonna represent my character. And so when we talk about the confidant, the role of the confidant, we talk about the role of representation matters. I was able to give her that space. I was able to understand what she was going through because I've walked that walk myself. But I was able to make sure that she felt like she had a safe space. She felt listened to, she felt heard. I remember her saying that at the end of our conversation. But the confidant of having that space to listen to and believe the negative experiences that person has experienced. Another one is the scholar. The scholar ally is one that tries to learn and listen as much about the challenges of underrepresented groups as possible and works to better themselves in the workplace as a result of their learnings. So a lot of different roles, and again, the idea is that allies will cycle through these roles depending on the situation and depending on what's needed in that particular moment. So there are differing degrees of allyship, and I kind of alluded to this a little bit earlier. Dr. Victoria Mattingly writes about the big A allyship and little a allyship. Big A refers to kind of these big steps that we take: sponsorship, activism, mentoring. Little a refers to those smaller steps, still important and equally important, but these are the smaller things that we do in allyship work, inviting others in. She talks about something called micro-affirmations, which I thought was wonderful because we always hear about microaggressions, micro-insults, micro-invalidations. Micro-affirmations is the opposite. It's positive, and it basically says it's ensuring someone feels seen and heard. It's validating, and it's positive in making sure that that person feels seen and heard. Both are needed, both the big A allyship and little a allyship. The difference is in personal impact and systemic impact. Next slide. So how am I an ally then to my fellow student or colleague? This is where I want to try to meld together the work of allyship, but also looking at how we understand the needs of minority students, how we understand the needs of minority faculty, and we also understand that this is a collective responsibility of us all. You'll hear me say over and over again that DEI work, well, one is not for the faint of heart, but the other thing is that it is the work of many and it is the work of the collective. So let's talk a little bit about how can I best be an ally to my fellow student or a colleague. So here's where I always like to start, and this is actually one of my favorite slides. I love this diagram because it gets us to think a little bit broader. It gets us to think a little bit more holistic about ourselves as a cultural being. So one of the things that I always start off with when I'm talking about diversity and diversity work is that, one, we have to have a lens where we move away from this idea that when we talk about cultural identity, that there is an otherness to that premise. And we have to stop speaking in terms of otherness. We have to think in terms of everyone is a cultural being, and that all of us, either voluntarily, involuntarily, unless we are Native or Indigenous people, we're either immigrants or ancestors of slaves, but that everyone has a cultural identity and that everyone is a cultural being. We move away from this idea of otherness. We think about the fact that there was such a push for assimilation into European, those of you that have European ancestry, there was such a push for assimilation that we have now gone to this idea that when we talk about diversity, we talk about culture, that it's only for marginalized, underrepresented beings and persons, but it's not. And so when I look at this slide and I say, do you see all of me? I'm trying to get us to an opportunity, and I'm trying to get us to this idea that first, when we start at the front, at the top with the green circle, the cultural dimensions, we think, of course, broadly about cultural identity, ethnicity, race, gender, age, sexual orientation, religion, spirituality, social class. But we also think of these other things and these very invisible and unseen factors. So we think about systemic factors, those systems that we exist in, historical, sociocultural, political, economic, those social norms and discourses. We think about our relationships, how we interact with others, our family, our friends, our community, our heritage, our chosen family, those people who may not be of a blood relation, but the people that we choose that have meaning in our lives and significance in our lives. We think about the personal contextual factors, genetics, our family history, our lived experiences, or our phenomenology. And then we think about all of the isms that are there and that are ever present. Racism, sexism, homophobia, heterosexism, ageism, xenophobia. So we have to think of, do you see all of me? And we have to think about this idea of cultural identity in terms of a very holistic picture, and do we see the whole person? Next slide. So I start with this one and I say, I see you, but are your needs being met? So if you've ever had, of course, an intro to psych course, you know that this is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. But I use this in this DI presentation because it is, there are parts of this hierarchy of needs that are going to be really important when we think about working with maybe students and faculty of color. So you have in this hierarchy, you have basic needs, psychological needs, self-fulfillment needs. But I want to draw our attention to, first, safety needs. This need to feel safe, this need to feel secure. And I also want to draw us to one of the psychological needs, belongingness. Anytime you're reading literature right now on DEI work, DEI research, you see and you hear this term of belonging and belongingness. And I want you to hold space because for these two needs in particular, safety needs and belongingness needs, because it's going to be really important in how we frame and how we shape the rest of the presentation going forward with talking about what are the needs of our minority students, what are the needs of our minority faculty, but safety and belongingness. Next slide. So I want to talk about student needs first. Underrepresented minority students' needs. I want to talk about peer and faculty mentorship, advising, recruitment and retention, and safety and belonging. What you'll also see is that I'm very much a visual speaker and presenter, and so I love to use charts and diagrams. I think that they capture our attention a little bit more. But I want to start with peer and faculty mentorship first. So what does the literature tell us about peer and faculty mentorship? Mentoring by faculty and peers, one, alleviates social pressures associated with college. It softens the transition into the academic community. It provides an environment in which to address challenges associated with being an underrepresented minority student, and it promotes coping skills and resiliency. So there is a lot that goes into this premise of faculty and peer mentorship. And I want to point out that this is an and, not an or. That they are both really important, that it should never only be peer mentorship, because I think that puts a lot on students. I think it has to be an and I think it's faculty and peer mentorship. But if we look at this literature and we look at the research, all the things that it helps the student acclimate to the college experience and to college life. The second one says students with mentors have higher GPAs and retention rates, and report increased commitment to their majors compared to those without mentors. So this idea of mentorship and this idea of built-in support for underrepresented minority students, the literature and the research tells us very clearly that it retains those students, they're more successful, they have higher GPAs, and they have an overall better experience. When we think about advising, advising, of course, is extremely important for students from underrepresented groups. When we think about advising, though, we think about it in the framework that it is an opportunity for you to do more than discuss classes, that you connect with students. We connect with them, we check in with them on their ability to adjust and acclimate, and it's our opportunity to assess their needs, to assess how they're adjusting to college, assess how their classes are going, but also what needs are met, what needs are not met, and how can I advocate, how can I be an ally for that particular student. Recruitment and retention, points to consider. The first point I always talk about is visibility of minority faculty on campus is important. For many minority students, a lot of times the questions they will ask is, can I see any part of myself reflected in the faculty here? Does that faculty have tenure or function in an administrative role? Because for students, what it says is continuity. It says, I'm going to form a relationship with this faculty member, with this administrator, but it says that there's continuity, that they're going to be here when I graduate. And that's something that's really important. DEI in all aspects of what we do as an institution as well, that it's embedded in the curriculum across disciplines. You may have heard the phrase decolonize your syllabi, and that is being very intentional about the authors that we use in our curriculum, who writes our textbooks, what voices are we amplifying. So are the readings in the textbooks representative of diverse voices and authors? This is a value statement from the instructor to select underrepresented authors and writings for that particular course and for that particular class. Consistently offering DEI events. In the DEI video that you probably saw up for Dream Week that I did, I talked about the fact that this is not a moment, but it's a movement. So we're always offering DEI events consistently across the academic calendar. And then again, emphasizing that this DEI work is the work of many, that there's a chief diversity officer, that there's a diversity committee or commission, there's student organizations, that there are allies, but that this is inclusive work and that it is a community and a communal type of work as well. Safety and belonging. Again, I emphasize safe spaces, allies, student groups where I can be a member and a leader, and building leadership skills. And then trust. Do I trust that my needs will be met? Do I feel a sense of belonging? Will my voice be heard if an issue or concern arises? And again, that goes back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs we talked about earlier, that sense of belonging, that sense of safety. I want to move into next faculty needs, underrepresented minority faculty needs. Here, some of the same, what you'll notice is that's a little bit of repetition of some items that were in the needs for underrepresented minority students. But here we talk about recruitment, transition and retention, And I'm going to talk a little bit about transition, because sometimes we talk about recruitment and retention. We don't talk enough about transition, and that's a really important piece. So I want to talk about that. I'll again talk about belonging. I'll talk about mentoring, something we saw with working with students, and then pathways to leadership as well. So I want to start here with recruitment, transition, and retention. We start with recruitment. We think about outreach, hiring, and yield. So we are focusing on our long-term efforts to build a diverse applicant pool. What does that look like? What does that feel like? That is making sure that we're connected to people who maybe are mentoring, students who might be in a doctoral program. And you might have a connection to someone who says, I have an outstanding doctoral student. They're going to graduate in the next year. I'm just keeping you abreast of their progress. Or you may have colleagues that are mentoring and working directly with students who are of underrepresented and minority groups, maybe working on research. But it's about building a long-term effect or a long-term effort to build a pool. Then we look at hiring. What is our process, selection, and short-term pool development? And then the yield, getting applicants to actually accept the offer. But the transition piece is sometimes not emphasized enough. And that's where I call it, we roll out the red carpet. How do we foster smooth and welcoming entry into the institution and into the campus community? Because that transition piece is what tells that person that has accepted the offer, this institution, this business, this corporation, they want to retain me. They want to keep me. And so that's the piece in the middle where they've accepted the offer, and then we're actively connecting them with people on campus. We're actively connecting them with mentors. We're actively connecting them before they set foot on campus. Retention, keeping faculty at the institution, professional development, advancement, and then satisfaction and support. So building skill and professional development in teaching, service, and research, of course, all part of the tenure and promotion process. Promoting successful navigation of tenure and promotion processes, and then addressing that, again, that sense of belonging and community work-life balance and satisfaction. But again, making sure that we are, again, paying attention to the transition piece. So I want to talk about belonging. I love this Venn diagram. I know I said I love one of the other slides as well, but I also love this one too. I love this Venn diagram because it specifically tells us, we always talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, but it tells us what happens when we don't have all three working at the same time. That's the missing piece, and that's the missing key. If we have diverse candidates or diverse employees, and we have equity, but we don't have inclusion, we have cultural assimilation that results in disengagement and low retention. So it tells us exactly, again, when we don't have all three working together, it tells us what happens and what we're missing. But it also tells us very clearly when we do have all three working in tandem and working with each other, then we have this sense of belonging. An organization that engages full potential of the individual. Innovation thrives. Views, beliefs, and values are integrated. This is probably a wonderful business model and a wonderful business approach, because you're getting the most out of your employees, you're getting the most out of your faculty and staff, and they are happy to be there. They are energized, they are creative, they are innovative. All the different things that make not only that person thrive, but it makes the institution thrive. So I think this Venn diagram in particular tells us how important each piece of diversity, equity, and inclusion is, and why it's important, and how it builds this sense of belonging. Mentoring for underrepresented or minority faculty as well can be formal or informal. Enhances community, sense of support. During that transition period, where we went back to that slide that talked about recruitment, transition, and retention, but during that transition period, it provides that hire with an opportunity to ask questions, get feedback on their syllabi, and start to develop relationships and start to develop collaborations before their arrival. Once they get here, that mentor can provide hands-on feedback. But this part is really important. When mentors are trained and they know how to engage in culturally responsive practices, what the research tells us is that women and men of color are more likely to feel affirmed and supported and to have a sense of community that mitigates the isolation of being the only or the only one of a few. There was a training I went to, and this actually was one of the things that came up, was asking participants, can you identify a time when you were the only? Or can you identify a time when you were the only of a few? And we talked about that sense of isolation. But when there's mentorship in place, especially culturally responsive practices and mentorship, how that's validating, it's affirming, it's supporting, and it helps to mitigate a lot of that feeling of isolation.
Can you explain just a little bit about culturally responsive practices?
Mm-hmm. So culturally responsive practices, I think, is going to really refer to mentors who have been trained in cultural humility. Cultural humility, that ability to kind of take a step back, have this understanding that this person's experience is this person's experience. And again, it really focuses on the ally work of it's not for me to interpret, it's not for me to try to put my spin on it. It is very much for me to try to amplify this person's story, to try to amplify this person's narrative. There's kind of an image of a stoplight that I always think of. The red is to listen. The yellow is to amplify, and by amplify it is, if I'm an ally, I'm saying, I think we need to listen to fill in the blank story. I think we need to support fill in the blanks idea. I think we need to do this. I think we need to do that. But it's not to change it in any type of way. And then the green light is to speak up. But I think the culturally responsive practices, also, I would say a couple extra things about that. I think that there's a lot of tools and inventories that also talk about, and one in particular that we use in counseling. I'll talk about that one. There's a document that came out in 1992. It was revised in 2015, and it was the multicultural competencies and social justice competencies. And what it does, it basically gives us a framework for what it is to be a culturally competent counselor, but really a culturally competent person in general, and a person and an advocate and an ally for social justice. And I use that example, and I turn to that example because oftentimes there's not something that gives us a roadmap. There's not something that espouses, well, this is what this looks like. This is what it looks like to be an ally, culturally responsive practices. But there are indeed some documents that I can point to that talk really a lot more about that. But really it's a training, really it's cultural humility. And I think it's also just kind of a deeper understanding of allyship, not the performative allyship. And the performative allyship is more, I think, about the iceberg. The performative allyship is I went out, I did something, and I'm putting it on social media. The real allyship is the iceberg that's underneath. The real allyship is I'm in a room, and maybe there are no underrepresented group minorities in the room. But despite that fact, I'm going to speak up, and I'm going to speak up on their behalf as if they're sitting right next to me. It's the deeper level systemic change that we're working towards. It's culturally responsive practices. But visually, I think about the iceberg of not the stuff we put on social media and the performative allyship, but the deeper level allyship of being culturally responsive. Thank you for the question, Dr. Holloman. I know that was a long way for me to get around to that answer as well. Okay, I think that's it for mentorship. Underrepresented groups in administration and leadership positions. Why is this important? So, back in 2018, Burke and Dillon, and this comes out of a business approach. They came up with something called the 8 Powerful Truths of Diversity and Inclusion. So what I did was I took 3 that I think are what I call standouts. And so the first one is diversity of thinking is the new frontier. High-performing teams are both cognitively and demographically diverse. Second one is diversity without inclusion is not enough. That goes back to that Venn diagram that we talked about earlier with diversity, equity, and inclusion, and what happens when they're not all working together at the same time. But this speaks to having a voice or a seat at the table. And then the third one is probably my favorite. Rewire the system to rewire behaviors. I think the more we normalize diversity, equity, and inclusion work, and we normalize also diversity training as part of normal operations. I think the more we see it, we hear it, we speak it, we do it, is the way that we rewire behaviors. So rewire the system to rewire behaviors. And then lastly, representation matters in any type of leadership, multi-level leadership, so that it is included in the narrative. And of course, eventually, it affects change. So I like to think of the anatomy of an ally. And I came across this one, and this one kind of struck me and stuck with me. But the anatomy of an ally, a mouth to speak out against injustice, a nose to sniff out bias, racism, and discrimination, eyes to identify privilege, ears to listen to the person of color experience, a heart to cultivate empathy, and then hands to take action and make change. I think all of these are needed. I think all of these are necessary, but I think this is what encompasses and what builds an ally for change. So I close with, I go back to something that I learned about in my doctoral program, and we read a book called The Tao of Leadership by John Heider. You may have heard of it. And it has a bunch of very short paragraphs, very short readings in it. But one of my favorites was Be Like Water. And that's kind of stuck with me. And so I thought about it today, and I said, be an ally, be like water. And the reading goes, the wise leader is like water. Consider water. Water cleanses and refreshes all creatures without distinction and without judgment. Water freely and fearlessly goes deep beneath the surface of things. Water is fluid and responsive. When I think about allyship, I think about, again, I go back to the description of the iceberg, that allyship work goes deep beneath the surface. I also think that about allyship in that an ally is fluid and responsive, and flexible in thought and flexible in their actions. But to be an ally is indeed to be like water. So I close with that, and I thank you for your presence, and I thank you for allowing me to be in this moment with you as well. Thank you.
I think given the microphone situation, you'll have to run your own question.
Okay, I will run my own question, and thank you, Dr. Holloman. So Sarah, I don't know if you want me to take questions from the audience here, if our online participants, if they can put it in the chat. Yes, okay. So while we're maybe getting to that, I'll ask, Dr. Holloman, thank you for asking the question that you did earlier, but I'll ask if anyone else here has a question or a thought or feedback.
I love the quote, Stephen.
Oh, yeah, thank you, Tina, I appreciate it.
What do you think is the most effective way for people who don't have exposure to anything in the way of diversity training, and what are the effective methods the ways that you think are most effective to begin to get people aware?
Um,
You might repeat the question for the Zoomers.
Okay, what is the most effective way maybe to start this process for those individuals who are maybe interested in diversity, equity, inclusion, but don't maybe have a background or training in this area? How do we get started? How do we start kind of this pathway down that particular road? I think a couple of things come to mind. The first thing is to find some really good, reputable resources. There are a lot of resources that, again, I will be sharing myself via the Centenary website. But I think finding good resources, I think one thing I read, and I thought it was really interesting, if you're on social media, and you're on Facebook or one of those types of platforms, one thing that one person said was to simply watch, listen, not respond, but connect yourself with people who belong to other groups that you do not belong to. Look at their Facebook post, look at the things that come up in their lives, look at the things that are important for them. But simply to not respond, not necessarily to respond to it, but to simply say, I'm listening. I think that's a very practical way to kind of start that process as well, because you start to, those things, those particular platforms start to give us a lens of maybe what that person's experiencing on a daily basis. They may talk about microaggressions. They may talk about these daily occurrences that they deal with. And it's making me think about from a mental health perspective as well, and from a physical health perspective, I think that there's also research and literature out there that now talks about the impact of daily microaggressions on a person of color's physical health and mental health as well. But paying attention to what they talk about, what's important, what is salient in their lives on social media, I think finding good resources, I think connecting, despite COVID. Typically I would say, if you're religious or spiritual, attend a different type of religious service, COVID permitting. But those very practical types of things, joining organizations where there are diverse voices and where there are a number of underrepresented minorities that are a part of that organization. But I think a lot of it is vicarious learning. I think a lot of it, of being an ally, again, is the attentive listening. And I think that's probably the first step, is the attentive listening. When we talk about the road to cultural competence, we talk about awareness, knowledge, and skills. The awareness piece always comes first. When I teach the multicultural class, I don't get into content at the very beginning. We do self-reflective exercises because I always lead off with who am I and who am I with others. We have to have an understanding before we're able to do the important work that we need to do for or on behalf of others. We have to have an understanding of who we are. And so the awareness piece, I think, would be where I would start, and those would be some practical recommendations. Wonderful question, thank you.
There's a couple in the chat, I can't read them.
Oh, okay. Can you give advice to someone who wants to be a good ally, but is afraid of messing up and accidentally making things worse? Yes. I think that's a common question. I think that's a common fear. So first I want to start and validate that. I think there are a lot of people who want to be allies, but who are very concerned about saying the wrong thing, doing the wrong thing, especially in the culture that we live in right now. We talk about cancel culture, and we talk about what happens when we accidentally say the wrong thing or make the wrong move. I think part of it is asking questions would be where I would start. And the perfect example that I always give when I'm training students to become therapists, I said, do you know one of the best things you can do is ask the person how to pronounce their name correctly? or if you're working with a client who their native language is not English, that you take the time to learn at least a few phrases in their native language. What it says and what it communicates, you're asking questions and you're saying, I want to be an ally, I want to be of assistance, I want to learn how to be an advocate. But I would like you to tell me how to best serve in that capacity, or give me some feedback on how I can do that work. So I think asking questions is probably the main thing and the first thing that I would start with. How can a DEI leader help diversify the academic offerings of the college? I think that may be something that is addressed on multiple levels at the institution. I think that if it's a student asking that question, I think it's talking with maybe faculty first. Faculty maybe bringing it up with the dean, talking with me. I'm happy to advocate as well as a DEI dean and chief diversity officer. But I think that speaks to what I talked about in the presentation, which is embedding diversity in the culture, into the culture of the institution, but in the curriculum as well. Sometimes I think we make the assumption that DEI work only fits in certain courses or only fits in certain curriculums. And granted, it may fit better in certain areas and may be a little bit more natural and organic, but it doesn't absolve the other disciplines from trying to incorporate and creatively think in terms of DEI and how it fits into that particular program and that particular curriculum. So I would say voicing some of that to who you're in contact with, if that's faculty, if that's a dean, but I think there are ways to kind of echo that and to voice that as well as a need. I know our main focus is centenary DEI, but is there a way we can scale our centenary's allyship to the wider Shreveport community? Yes. I think there's always a way that we want to be reaching to the broader Shreveport-Bossier community. That speaks to, I'm glad someone asked that question, I think that goes back to safety and belonging. I had a colleague at a different institution say that some of the students felt that they only felt safe on campus, but that when they went out into the rest of the community, it was so different. So they felt like they were in a bubble on campus, which was good because it meant the institution was doing something right. But when they went out into the rest of the world and they went out into the rest of the community, they did not feel that way. So I think a lot of it is the reaching across the table that I talked about earlier, partnering, making community connections. But I think definitely there's a way and a need to continue to do that work. And so I think part of it's visibility. I think as businesses, entities, organizations, corporations see the allyship work that Centenary is doing, I think that is the inviting in part. And I think that is the part of them also wanting to form that collaboration and form that relationship with us. So some of that is also visibility. Same question? Okay. Did I answer all of them? Perfect. All right. Any other questions or comments, or I will turn it over to Dr. Holloman.
We'll come up and close this out.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pierce.
Thank you.
Thanks for all who came. Thanks for those who attended. I'm sure that like you, I'm very grateful for Dr. Pierce's presence and the leadership that she's providing already in 3 days on campus or whatever it's been. So we know we have a lot of work to do on campus and in our community, and we look forward to working on it together. Thanks, everybody. Have a good night.
Thank you.